Pleasure to be with everybody. Before we begin, I just want to say a special word of thanks to our colleagues at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Those are the two federal agencies that are co-funders with the U.S. Endowment in the Healthy Watersheds Consortium Grant Program, and without their support, the program wouldn't be possible. So we are delighted to have them as partners and thrilled that they value these projects as much as we do. Just a reminder that more information on the Healthy Watersheds Consortium Grant Program is available on the Endowment's website, which is usendowment.org, and you'll see a tab in the upper right for Healthy Watersheds, and that's where the request for proposals and application form and other materials are found. And we have a new deadline that's fast approaching, February 1, 2018. So please visit our website for more information. And especially thrilled today to have the crew from Western Rivers Conservancy with us. This is a project that just knocked our socks off. They have some big, audacious goals with regard to watershed protection and have undertaken a number of innovative financing tools to get there. And I'm very excited to learn more about those, and I hope you all will be too. I think the scheme that they've used is possible elsewhere. So there's good potential for learning for everyone listening in. And so, Sue, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you'd introduce your team and get started, that'd be terrific. Sue Doroff, everybody.
Well, thank you, Peter. Could we move to the next slide? Thank you. Hey, so first, just to start, I want to put in a pitch for Miracle on 34th Street and put it over the top. Just saying. So I want to thank Peter and U.S. Endowment for this opportunity to talk with you today about our Blue Creek project and some of the innovative mechanisms we use in our work. It's really exciting for us to get to share, especially to help others walk in our footsteps. So, but first, just a bit about Western Rivers Conservancy. We've been around since '88. Our mission is to acquire lands to permanently protect them along the great rivers of the West for the benefit of fish, wildlife, and people. Some of you might know our motto, which is sometimes to save a river, you have to buy it. And we know you can't buy a river, but it certainly embodies what we stand for. We have a staff of just 18. With offices sprinkled throughout the West in California, Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. We have active projects on 22 rivers in 6 states. So today, you're going to be hearing from 3 of us. Josh Kling, and you can see him there with his smiling face and his lab, Lucky Camper. And then Zach Spector, and yes, Zach only has a beta fish, but we love him anyway. And Zach's our project operations director, and he's been with Western Rivers for 5 years, compared with Josh, our chief science guy, who's been with us since 1999. I was trying to do the math, Josh, and it's just a long time.
18 years.
18 years and counting. And I've been here since the beginning of time. I've dedicated my conservation career to saving the great rivers of the West. And after more than 25 years in the business, I still love doing what we do, believe it or not. I think that's because every project we work on is different and requires different approaches, different partners, different solutions. And so the creative and innovative is something that we specialize in and I take great pleasure in doing. Next slide, please. Today, we will be discussing our Blue Creek project. Blue Creek, and you can see it here in the image, is just beautiful, but it's one of the most important cold water tribs in the Klamath system, and Josh Kling will tell us a lot more about that in a minute. Almost 15 years ago, we began an effort to create a crucial cold water sanctuary for salmon at Blue Creek. And at the same time, we had the opportunity to repatriate lands to the Yurok Tribe and establish a tribal community forest. And in that map on the left, you can kind of get a feel for the Yurok Tribe's current ownership, which is just a ribbon following the Klamath River. And this project, this 47,000 acre project, is highlighted in that buff and salmon colors. Increases their land base many, many times over. Others have said, and I like to repeat, that this may be one of the most important conservation projects in America. It's an ambitious effort. The price tag was close to $60 million. We signed a purchase contract just before the market crash in 2008, and that market collapse made an already challenging project far more challenging and complicated. So, in order to meet our contractual obligations, we had to find a way to fund the project in a timely way, and we turned to non-traditional financing mechanisms. You know, what they say about necessity is true. It is the mother of invention, and I'm pleased and proud at the creative capital stack we were able to construct. Today, we'll share with you 3 of the financing mechanisms we used in this project. But first, I want to mention a bit about U.S. Endowment and the Healthy Watersheds program. Next slide, please. The cost of the project isn't just the dirt, as you no doubt know. It's the cost of bringing the project to fruition, developing it from inception to completion. In this case, our cost exceeds $5 million to date and might still be more. So we need help from our friends, from our foundations, from our funders, and U.S. Endowment has been one of those funders and have helped bring us across the finish line in this project. We're deeply appreciative of their support. You can see we've received 2 grants to date, 2016 for $100,000 and 2017 for $210,000. Some of that 2017 award also went to the Yurok Tribe for some of their building management capacity for long-term management of these lands. And the pie chart gives you a feel for who else is supporting our work and the kind of leverage a Healthy Watersheds award can deliver. Our partnership with U.S. Endowment has been critical to our success, both now and into the future. Okay, so let's get going. Josh Kling is going to take the helm and give us a quick overview of the project.
Terrific. Thank you, Sue.
Next slide, please.
Again, this is Josh Kling, Conservation Director with Western Rivers Conservancy, and I'm going to walk you briefly through some of the ecological benefits of the project. The project is located in the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion, which straddles the state line between southwestern Oregon and northwestern California. This is one of the Earth's biodiversity hotspots. It's a UNESCO biosphere reserve. There's over 3,500 species of plants, including 220 endemic species. There are 2 arteries that drain the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion. On the north, you have the Rogue River, and to the east and southern part of the ecoregion, you have the Klamath River. This project is located just upstream of the mouth of the Klamath River on the east side of Redwood State and National Parks. It's a huge area. It's 73 square miles, which is the equivalent of 3 times the size of the island of Manhattan. The project goals include saving some of the most important runs of salmon and steelhead on the west coast. The Klamath River historically was the 3rd largest producer of salmon and steelhead on the entire west coast, and that basin is the most recoverable major river system for salmon and steelhead on the west coast. The project is also conserving and restoring habitat for listed species, including northern spotted owl, marbled murrelet, and Humboldt martin. Next slide, please. We're creating 2 conservation areas with the Blue Creek Klamath River project. The first, if you look at the map, there's a lighter green area. That is the Yurok Tribe Community Forest. The management regime will be for sustainable timber harvest with 80 to 100-year rotations, no chemical applications, major road decommissioning, and an emphasis on native habitat restoration. The darker green area will be the Blue Creek Salmon Sanctuary. All management in this area will be dedicated to species recovery and habitat enhancement. The management goals for the Salmon Sanctuary will be creation of late cereal forest conditions. It will complement habitat in the upper basin. Again, if you look at the map, the majority of the Blue Creek watershed is pristine and protected in the Siskiyou Wilderness area as a part of the Six Rivers National Forest. And this project will conserve the entirety of the lower basin, complementing the wilderness area and the habitat found there. One of the most important things about Blue Creek in terms of salmon and steelhead is the thermal refugia that it provides. Blue Creek flows cold and clear year-round. It enters the Klamath River 16 miles upstream from the ocean. 100% of all the salmon and steelhead that are migrating from the ocean upriver to the spawning grounds in the upper basin stop in Blue Creek and lower their body temperatures by 8 degrees Fahrenheit. This habitat is critical to the long-term persistence of Klamath River salmon and steelhead.
Next slide, please. So we can't do any presentation without talking about the importance of this project for conservation and for the Yurok Tribe. This is the center of their homeland and their spiritual center. And but we're here to talk about how we did it and how do you fund a project of this scale in difficult times. In this case, our contract started ticking, and we had obligations to close on a closing schedule. And so we needed to identify sources of funding that could deliver capital relatively quickly according to our schedule. And public funding, both federal and state, were not going to be available. We watch what happens around the country and the landscape, and we were vaguely aware of these kinds of funding mechanisms and had wondered if there would ever be a way to employ one of them in one of our projects. We never imagined that we would combine all three of these mechanisms in one project. But we did, and you can see the results from this pie chart. With the exception of the federal tribal settlement, $10 million, and the state of California, $8 million, the remainder of the funds that came to the project are private. Even the EPA revolving loan is being repaid with proceeds from revenues generated from the landscape, also private funds. So at the end of the day, once all loans are repaid, only 1/3 or $18 million of the capital needed to bring this $60 million project to fruition was public money. And if you had asked me if this would be possible at the beginning of this project, I would have laughed and said absolutely not. But it's my firm belief that for any truly outstanding conservation project, the money will come. Next slide, please. So now let's get to the meat of what we're here to talk about today. This is the first funding mechanism that we used, and this is the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. The Clean Water Act established the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. And the purpose of the program is there on the slide. It provides communities a permanent independent source of low-cost financing for a wide range of water quality infrastructure projects. Really, that's code for bricks and mortar projects, building sewage treatment plants, and the like. It's been in use since '89, and the total amount invested exceeds $111 billion, a huge chunk of change. EPA, everything changed in 2009. But before I get to that, I'm sorry, I just want to say that the structure for this program, EPA uses facilitating agencies to run this program. Each state implements the program slightly differently. And so different states will have different levels of experience in using this fund, different kinds of projects they'd like to use this fund for. And so you really need to assess where a given agency is in its maturity using this fund as part of your assessment about whether this fund could really be something you could use for your project. In our case, our project is in California, and we had to work with and through the State Water Resources Control Board. California gets about $450 million annually. And then also, just as an aside, nationally, the program allocates about $30 million specifically for tribes. Next slide, please. So in 2009, everything changed for those of us in conservation when the program was expanded to include non-point source pollution projects or pollution reduction projects. An example of a pollution reduction project is a marina or conserving a wetland or some hydromodification projects, but it also includes forestry. And that's our ticket into this program. So no longer was the program just for bricks and mortar. And today in California, about 4% of the State Water Resources Control Board funding is for non-point source projects. Some important things to know. Only a municipality or tribe is eligible for these types of financing, so your project really needs to have a partner that fits. And not all loans will have the same terms. If you take the time and carefully book down on the program, you'll see there's different provisions and for different situations, and they will yield different interest rates and terms. Because of our set of circumstances, being in a severely economically depressed community and working with a tribe, we were able to secure an $18.75 million loan for the Yurok Tribe to repay over a 20-year term, which is substantially longer than usual, with 0% interest. That's 0% interest. That is free money. And so the Yurok are able to repay their loan by harvesting, doing sustainable forestry, and selling carbon offsets, and essentially receive the land for free. Of course, having a repayment schedule vetted by a public agency is always a challenge, and in our case, revenues from the sale of carbon offsets were viewed skeptically. Carbon was a relatively new program in California when we began this project, and we had a pretty tough time convincing the board of the State Water Resources Control Board that carbon wasn't all smoke and mirrors, and that in fact it was a reasonable source of revenue to repay the loan. I mention this because you could have a similar situation with a different repayment strategy. It's tough to take new innovative ideas through public entities without getting a lot of pushback. In this case, they made us sell our carbon early on a forward contract, and we literally had to leave millions of dollars on the table to allow carbon to stand as a repayment strategy. So the takeaway here is that depending on what state you're working in and what kind of project you're doing, you may very well have a learning curve, a steep education process you'll need to undertake with the agency you're working with if you intend to rely on some of these non-traditional financing mechanisms. Now, I'd like to move on. Zach Spector is going to talk about carbon. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Sue. Again, I'm Zach Spector. I'm the Project Operations Director here at Western Rivers, and I will talk about carbon. So, generally speaking, at the highest level, a carbon project is any project that receives compensation in exchange for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So when we say we sold carbon to help pay for the Blue Creek property, what we really mean is we sold carbon offset credits. We sold them on the open market as part of the California Cap and Trade Program. And the Cap and Trade Program was created in 2006 under the Global Warming Solutions Act, otherwise known as AB 32. So a carbon offset credit has a specific definition, and that definition is that it's equal to 1 metric ton of CO2. And there's lots of different ways to do carbon projects. You can do livestock manure digesters, you can do destruction of ozone depleting substances, or like we did at Blue Creek, you can do a forestry project. Specifically, we undertook an improved forest management project, and that means we undertook activities that will maintain or increase carbon stocks on our forest. And another way to think about that is that we've committed to transitioning an industrial forest landscape to sustainable forestry. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of benefits to doing a carbon project. Principally among them is this is a great way to generate revenue, to generate non-traditional private capital. That can be used to cover management costs year over year, or that can be used in a one-time flush up front to help pay for the cost of your project. The way you start a carbon project is by looking at your forest and understanding what kind of resources you have on the property. For example, at Blue Creek, we had a forest with mature, old-growth, diverse, healthy landscape. That gave us the opportunity, when compared with the baseline, which is industrial forestry and that geography, to sequester a lot of carbon right off the bat in a one-time flush, which means we were able to get a bump, a sale bump initially. In a year-over-year growth situation, you can still generate revenue for your project, even if you don't have that one-time bump. So in a typical industrial forest landscape, if you commit to growing carbon, growing healthy, diverse trees over time, you can sell that year over year to help pay for management activities. The second benefit to a carbon project is that it adds a protective conservation overlay. This is a 100-year commitment. It's maybe not perpetuity, but it's pretty darn good. And it, again, is committing you to transition from industrial forestry to sustainable forestry, which we're certainly supportive of. And the third benefit is pretty obvious. It reduces carbon emissions. Next slide, please. Of course, there are certainly risks with undertaking a carbon project. The first is that it's very expensive and it's very hard to budget. It may cost you up to $500,000 in upfront costs, and that has to do with modeling. It has to do with your inventory. You have to hire outside help to do this. You need statisticians and biometricians who can actually calculate what kind of carbon stocks you have on your property. And any small mistake can actually have a pretty big impact. So when we were going through this project, we actually had to go back and re-verify, re-inventory, and resubmit our project because we'd actually underreported the amount of carbon that we were sequestering. And that cost us tens of thousands of dollars and a couple months of lost time. So it's hard to be exactly accurate the first time around. The second risk is that it's a long and it's an unpredictable time frame. It's going to take at least 1 year before your project generates any revenues, and that's a lot of cost up front before anything comes back in the back door. Additionally, the landowner of the property is committed to 100 years of management to benefit the carbon project, and that's a lot more than some people are willing to take on. Finally, there's no guarantees. You can start a carbon project, and by the time that you are ready to sell your carbon offset credits, the market may be down, it may be on a different place than you hoped or expected, and it may make your project not economically viable at that time. Next slide. Okay, so I guess the question kind of becomes, what makes a good carbon project? How can we as a nonprofit or a tribe or someone else think about what we can do and what we can't do? Well, it's pretty idiosyncratic. You really have to look at the specifics of your forest, where you're located, what kind of trees you have on the property. But there are a few things that are generally helpful to consider. The first is size. These need to be pretty big projects. We found that it's not economic if you're below about 3,000 acres. And that just has to do with all of the upfront costs that are inevitable in any project. The second thing you need to do is you really need to look carefully at the protocol's eligibility criteria. These projects, to sell carbon on the California market, they do not have to be in California. Ours happen to be in California, which was great, but they're not required. But they must be on private or non-federal public lands. I have not personally seen a non-federal public lands project go through yet, but they are possible. The second thing you need to consider with the eligibility criteria is that you need to move your project lands into sustainable forest management, and this requires either outside certification like FSC certified or a federal or state approved forest management plan, which is what we did at Western Rivers. And again, you're trying to grow a native forest, so that means you need native species, you need natural local species, multiple age classes, and if you start with a plantation, that's okay, but you have to move it into to mimic a natural forest. Really quickly before I pass it back to Sue, I do want to mention a couple other things. First is about conservation easements in carbon. It's generally thinking conservation easements and carbon are non-compatible. There are exceptions. In California, for example, there's a 12-month grace period that if you place a conservation easement on your property and you intend to place a carbon project as well on your property, you have 12 months to get your project initiated. Conservation easements are not explicitly prohibited from the protocol, but they do increase that delta, or that baseline, which makes it less likely to be economically viable. We also know that as of right now, forest legacy easements and carbon projects are not compatible. And then the last question you'd ask yourself is, what kind of are you looking for? Again, do you have big old trees on your property? If so, maybe you can be eligible for initial capital flush. Or are you okay selling the growth year over year as a source of revenue for ongoing management activities? Those are the types of questions that you need to be thinking about. What does your project specifically need?
And so I just want to chime in here. Really what Zach's saying here is carbon can deliver two kinds of revenue streams to you. If you intend to be a long-term manager, it's a terrific way to deliver revenues periodically over time to assist in your management expenses. And because it still allows you to manage your landscape, it still allows you to have a sustainable forestry management regime, and that you'll receive in a 1 to 3 year cycle revenues. The other way it's useful is to have this big hit of money and help you with the acquisition right off the bat. And so different landscapes will deliver different things. And finally, at the beginning of the pie chart, you saw how much carbon delivered. And because this is an expensive, time-consuming, somewhat fraught with peril process, but it's delivered $5 million to date for us, and we expect it to deliver several million more. And so it's surely worth it if you have the right set of circumstances.
Absolutely.
Next slide, please. So you thought the first two mechanisms were a little tricky, but this one takes the cake. The New Markets Tax Credits, which we've given a subheading for of deciphering the indecipherable. How hard can it be? The concept of New Markets is simple. The program was created by the U.S. Treasury Department to encourage outside investment in low-income communities for the purpose of fostering job creation and economic revitalization. When we say low income, what that really means is specifically that your project has to be located within a census tract that meets the definition, and there is one, of severely economically depressed. If you do meet that definition, this program can be a tremendous source of private capital. In fact, it can deliver up to 20% of your overall project cost. But deciphering the indecipherable, this is an incredibly complex and challenging process. It's expensive, requires tremendous legal expertise, sophistication, and a fair amount of creativity. It's difficult for anyone but an expert to understand. And even today, my understanding wanes after I stop thinking about it for 6 months or so, and I have to go back and re-educate myself because it's just so dang complicated. As a result, it's difficult to explain to funders, to explain to your board, to assess your risks, to explain to agencies, just about everyone. And just to note, this is also a project that's typically used for bricks and mortar projects. In this case, health clinics, gas stations, but not forest land. So it's just not that simple. Next slide, please. So the easiest way to understand how to approach new markets tax credits is to think about who the key players are that you'll need to assemble to undertake a new markets tax credit project. Because, first you'll say, okay, am I in a severely economically distressed census tract? Check that box, yay. But then you'll want, given that this is a tax credit program, you'll want to identify a tax credit investor that might be interested in participating in your project. And a tax credit investor is an entity that's interested in investing in the project for a 7-year period, and we'll get to that 7 years, in return for a tax credit equal to 39% of the investment. So if it's a $10 million investment, they'll get a $3.9 million tax credit. The tax credit investor will pay between 80 and 90 cents on the dollar to enjoy that 39% tax credit. So in our case, we were able to partner with U.S. Bank Community Development Corporation as our tax credit investor. Next, and perhaps most importantly, you need to find a community development entity to partner with. And the community development entity is simply the organization that's eligible for and applies for allocation from the U.S. Treasury New Markets Tax Credit Program. Attracting a CDE that has received or is likely to receive a tax credit is highly competitive. You need to cultivate relationships with potential CDEs until you identify a handful that are likely to have an interest in your project if they receive an allocation. In our case, we just by sheer luck found the perfect CDE in Opportunity Fund based in California. They're mission-driven, creative, and just happen to love rivers and river conservation. Opportunity Fund has been fortunate in that they have received a generous allocation from the program several years running. But it doesn't always work that way. Allocations are done annually. No one really knows exactly when the allocation will be made. This is by Treasury. And it's hard to predict and a bit fickle. And every year, there are winners and losers. Someone who's received tax credits year in and year out will get zeroed out. Sometimes they alternate every other year. They don't like to give it every year to some. It's just hard to predict. And then finally, we should mention the Qualic Bee. And Zach and I and Josh think Qualic Bee is part of Webster's dictionary, but it turns out it's not. Qualic Bee is a qualified, active, low-income community business. It's the entity. The entity has to have as its sole purpose operating in this economically depressed community, and it must engage in activities that are consistent with its tax-exempt purpose, essentially a single-purpose entity. And so in our case, we, Western Rivers Conservancy, formed a Qualic Bee. We created a 509c3 that's a supporting organization of Western Rivers Conservancy, and its mission is exclusively to support Western Rivers Conservancy's mission. And this entity manages the lands. It has to perform all the compliance requirements associated with the new markets transaction, and it's obligated to own the lands for a minimum of 7 years. And in fact, all players are committed for 7 years. And this is to prevent footloose investment, where you take advantage of the tax credit and you run instead of creating jobs and having economic revitalization benefits. In our case with Western Rivers, we form this Qualic Bee and we'll own and manage the lands, and when that minimum 7 years forbearance period expires, we'll be able to unwind, that's the term of art, unwind the new market structure and convey the land to the Yurok. So, once you have the tax credit investor and community development entity in place, you have what you need to get going. Next slide, please. And you get this. I love this chart. It's the best representation available to follow the flow of funds and all the relationships in a new markets transaction. Needless to say, it takes quite a bit of time and more than one sitting to digest this chart. But what I would like you to appreciate from this chart is the funds flow as an equity investment and a leverage loan at the top. The equity investment is essentially what the tax credit investor is paying for the tax credit. And the leverage loan comes from the other capital you've assembled for your acquisition. And so you put the tax credit investors' funds and you put your leveraged funds, your funds into the project, and they flow down to the Qualic who will acquire the property with that combination of equity investment and leverage loan. How's that? Clear as mud, I bet, huh? Well, you'll get it over time. But the important takeaways from this chart is to see where the players feed in and understand, as you'll see, everyone's getting paid. The lawyers are getting paid, the CDE is getting paid, the Qualic is getting paid, and the tax credit investors getting tax credits. In this example, Western Rivers put in $8 million and combined it with proceeds from the sale of tax credits to generate the remainder of funds needed to purchase the property and pay all of the costs. So we end up with about just shy of $2 million in proceeds that we applied to purchase of the property. That's a sizable amount of money, and we think it's worthwhile. But of course, with rewards comes risk. Next slide, please. And there are risks and challenges. There are rigorous compliance requirements, audit requirements, tax reporting, and you have to get it all right. There's job impact surveys. You really do need to see your project generating jobs and having economic benefits on the ground. In the case of conservation forestry, there is job creation. There's jobs in the woods, restoring forest land, fisheries work, and then of course there's economic development and tourism to be taken into account. But really, the work in the forest for the sustainable forestry activities and the restoration activities are enough to generate jobs. You have to have staying power. You know, this 7 years is a long time if it's not how you usually do business. And if you fail to meet the compliance requirements, the penalties are substantial. You'll have to return all the funds you've received, even the ones you paid out to the lawyers and consultants and CDE, and then there's additional financial penalties on top of that. You just don't want to see a recapture. And obviously, with a financing mechanism that's this complicated, again, it's difficult to explain, and I have to say it's the most difficult to explain. Carbon is simple compared to explaining new markets tax credits. So agencies trying to understand this transaction structure, even on their their second and third take, they think it's a scam and that someone's getting away with something. And it's a program of the U.S. Treasury, but all the same, it looks like you're getting something for nothing. And you can work through all this, but don't underestimate the amount of effort and pushback you will experience. And in fact, having agency attorneys try to understand a new markets program is probably the worst possible scenario. Attorneys hate to say they don't know something. We had an attorney with one state agency we were working with try to learn about new markets on the internet instead of consulting with an expert. and that just simply just isn't a successful strategy. And then finally, in terms of risks, the timing is just completely unpredictable. So it works best if you aren't working against a deadline. For example, if you have a contractual obligation to close by a certain date, we would recommend that you have bridge financing or interim financing to allow you to buy and hold the property until such time as you're ready to put the to set the flow of funds going with the new market structure. Things can go very quickly once they're on track, but it takes a bit of doing to get things going. So, is it worth it? You bet. I mean, generating 20% of the purchase price is pretty swell. But you will need to know where the other 80% of the funding is coming from. It's the last 20%, not the first. So, to get started, you need two things. You need to be in a severely economically depressed census tract, and you need scale. Projects need to be at least $5 million and preferably larger. So here's my best pro tip. Hire a specialist to help you. There are only a handful of attorneys in the country that specialize in new markets, and you'll want to engage one of them right off the bat. We've seen tens of thousands of dollars wasted with people going to their trusted law firm and asking them, do they know how to do new markets? And of course they say yes, and then they don't. Next slide. If I started with this and I want to end with this, for an important project, there's always a way to fund it, and money will come. But you need to have the right set of circumstances. So I think on your team, you need to be creative. You need to be able to think outside the box. Look around. Look at how other projects have been funded. Look at other for-profit projects. Don't just follow your same formula. Be creative. And then you need the right tools for the job. If you need immediate funding, you know, some of your other traditional funding sources won't work. Or if you have a long run out, you have more time to work through some of the issues. So you need to find the right funding source for the job. And remember, you don't need to rely on public funds or grants. There are sources out there, like the three we've described, although the first is an EPA revolving loan, so legitimately you can think of that as public funding, but it isn't traditional conservation funding. And then expertise. I can't underscore enough, whether it's carbon or whether it's new markets, you need to hire an expert. Assembling the best team for the job is crucial. You need a forester that specializes in carbon to help you assess your carbon project and run it through. You need an attorney that specializes in new markets. It's just money well spent. And then I think one of our greatest assets is our tenacity. And none of this is easy. We have, and we all, anyone in this business knows, there's ups and downs with every project, and surely for a good deal of the time we're uncertain what the light at the end of the tunnel is, whether it's the train or the sun. But you need to hang in there, be light on your feet, be willing to give up one pathway and move to another, go with the flow. And finally, this can't be done without financial support from donors. We're discussing capital funding to acquire a project, but as we all know, you need project development funding as well to underwrite the expenses that you incur. Which brings me full circle back to U.S. Endowment. I want to thank Peter and the U.S. Endowment team for their support and enthusiasm for this project. It truly is a wonderful project, but for it to be recognized by your peers and funders is delightful. So we appreciate the opportunity to talk about our Blue Creek project. We could talk about it all day, and some of our favorite conservation financing mechanisms. But at this point, I'll turn it back to Peter.
Sue, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Inspirational, and we're all ready to take a rafting trip whenever you'll have us.
You betcha.
One quick. Oh, I bet
ahead.
snorkeling is awesome. Yeah. Just a quick question for you. Is this the largest project Western Rivers has undertaken by dollar amount? You mentioned $60 million.
It is the largest by ecoregion scale, by ecoregion dollar amount.
Okay. And you referenced several times the need to bring in expertise and things like that. When you did that for this project, did you do that primarily through consultants, or did you hire new staff? How did you get the capacity you needed to pull this off?
You know, that's a terrific point. We hired consultants to help us with both projects, both mechanisms. With carbon, we ended up bringing that expertise in-house because of our 7-year commitment and our management needs for the landscape. But I think it can be accomplished entirely with third parties, trusted third parties.
So you don't necessarily have to bulk up your own staff. If you can find the right consultants and you've got the financial support to engage them, that would work.
Yes, and not only that, I think it's the best path forward, because these kinds of things are so specialized. No one organization could keep someone busy. You really want someone who eats, lives, and breathes this stuff. So you're best suited to having a long-term consultant who you trust and will be there going forward.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Sue, this is Ellie. We have another question from an audience member. How do we know if a new market tax credit might be a fit for our project? What are the necessary project ingredients to even consider looking at a new market tax credit?
Well, you know, really, you just need two fundamental ingredients. You need to be in the right place, a severely economically distressed census tract. There's three. You need to have 80% of your funding in your sites, and you need to have a project of sufficient scale. If you have those three things, if you're just short 20% of your project expense, then I think you're ready to go talk to people and see if there's folks that might be interested. The reason for the severely economically depressed census tract is this program is meant to lower the barrier to entry and allow for an investment in areas that wouldn't otherwise receive it. And so the flip side of that is that it creates jobs. And as I said, a forestry and conservation project can fit that bill with jobs in the woods, but it needs to do that.
Great, thanks, Sue. I'll remind all of our participants that they can submit their questions in the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner. We've got ample time to respond to other questions. And in the meantime, I think we have one more from Peter.
Yeah, Sue, and I think it was Zach that was talking about this. I didn't quite understand the statement about conservation easements and carbon not being compatible. Could you give a touch more information on that?
Well, I'll start and have Zach finish. What we're talking about is a carbon volume is determined, what you have available to sequester, by moving from a traditional industrial forestry management regime to a conservation management regime. And so that delta, that difference between an industrial management regime and a conservation management regime creates volume. So when you put a conservation easement in place, you're saying that baseline is no longer industrial, but that baseline is the conservation easement. So you shrink up that delta, you shrink up the difference between what a conservation management regime would be and the new baseline, which is a conservation easement. And so what's happened in the state of California is we've said, hey, this is another way to fund conservation. Why would you ding us and say, if I put a conservation easement on, it's already protected, when this is another way to get to accomplish the overall conservation project? And so they've said that makes sense. So, okay, at the time you're putting the conservation easement on, if it's transparent and we know that you're going to be partially funding this by developing and selling carbon offsets, then we'll accept that reality, even though our conservation easement is supposed to remove that industrial management regime. And so if you are able to be transparent and you initiate your project with their 12-month window, that's their fix for addressing this duplicative overlay. Zach, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that really covers it, Sue. The only other point that I made, Peter, was that every conservation easement is different. It has different intentions. What we have not been successful with to date, and I'm not aware of anybody having been successful, is having a federal forest legacy conservation easement that is compatible with a carbon project.
And if I could chime in, that may not remain to be the case. I think it's just like we experienced with the State Water Resources Control Board. There's an education process, and I think the Forest Service and the Forest Legacy Program continue to view carbon askance, but I think the discussions are ongoing, and we may very well, at the end of the day, find some accommodation with them as well.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Sue, we have another question around new market tax credits. So it sounds like there must also be some sort of revenue generating enterprise as part of the project plan. So would a straight conservation project also qualify?
Wow, that's such a great question. So it's a little tricky because there's just a little suspension of you have to just take some of this stuff on faith. And so in the case of new markets, you absolutely have to demonstrate the ability to repay. There's something called a true debt test. Is it real? And so in the case of a forestry project, our ability to repay would be by harvesting trees. And even in our scenario, we have a sustainable forestry component and a carbon component. So those are both recognized as abilities to repay. But if there's no carbon component and it's just straight forestry, but you don't intend to harvest, can it work? And the answer is still yes, because if you looked at our crazy chart there at the top, you'll see that the leverage lender, the largest amount of money going into the tax structure is your own. And so the interest that's being paid over that 7-year period to the leverage lender comes to you. So even though you might have a $200,000 interest payment a year and an obligation to repay, and you're showing forestry as a way to repay it, but you don't intend to ever cut a tree, that's okay, because you're paying yourself over and over and over again. It recirculates. See why people think it's a scam?
Thank you, Sue. That's great. This is Peter. We're out of time, but that was a sensational presentation. Thanks to you and Zach and Josh for lots of great information. I know people may have other questions and they can follow up with you guys if they do, but a terrific project, and we appreciate your tenacity and your innovation in making it work. So thank you very, very much. We're pleased to be your partner.
Likewise, likewise. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Peter.
Great. Thank you. Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you.